The deep space research vessel Event Horizon floats near the edge of known space. Its crew celebrates a monumental discovery, a stable wormhole they have named the Janus Gate. Dr. Eris Thorne sends a triumphant message back to Earth. "We have done it," he says. "We have opened a gateway to another star system." His words are met with a sudden burst of terrifying static. An unseen force breaches their systems, and the transmission cuts out. The only thing left is a chilling final whisper that echoes through the communications array. "It sees us. By the end of this story, you will understand the true cost of reaching into the dark, and what it means to be truly seen by something ancient and hungry. What waits on the other side of a door that should never be opened, and what happens when the lock itself breaks? What price would you pay for a discovery that could end your world?" The celebration died in a flicker of dying lights. A deep, resonant hum that had been the ship's constant heartbeat stuttered, faltered, and then surged with a violent pitch that made the deck plates shudder. Emergency lighting bathed the command deck in a bloody crimson glow, casting long, dancing shadows that felt more like accusations. Static hissed from every speaker, a sound like 1,000 angry whispers. Eva Ristova's hands flew across her pilot console, her face a mask of controlled panic. She called out, her voice tight, her words cutting through the chaos. "The Janus Gate is not stable, it is growing. The sensor readings are impossible. It has expanded to 10 times its documented size in the last 3 minutes. It is no longer a doorway, it is a maw." Across from her, Lieutenant Ben Carter slammed his fist against his own station. "It is not just the wormhole. Something is in our systems. Our navigation data is being overwritten. The star charts are shifting into patterns I have never seen. It is rewriting our own maps, locking out my commands." He looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. "The ship is no longer taking our orders. We are passengers here." A new sound cut through the static, silencing the alarms and the crew's frantic voices. It was a voice, but not one that belonged to any human. It poured from the intercom, a distorted chorus of layered tones, deep and high, speaking in a language the ship's computer instantly translated yet failed to fully contain. The words were clear, but the meaning behind them felt alien, a conceptual shiver that ran down the spine. "The barrier is thin," it stated, each syllable hanging in the air. "The key has been turned." Engineer Miles Kuroda, his hands trembling over the main engineering terminal, watched in horror as his screens dissolved into cascading lines of code he did not recognize. "It is not just in navigation," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It is in everything. The core programming has been overwritten. A foreign data stream has rooted itself into the ship's heart." He pointed a shaking finger at his central display, where a single, stark sequence of numbers now dominated. It created this, a countdown timer, but for what? The numbers continued their inexorable descent, a digital heartbeat pulsing toward an unknown event. It does not correspond to any system function, no life support cycle, no navigational checkpoint. It is just counting. What happens when it reaches zero? The question hung in the crimson-lit air, unanswered and terrifying. The ship was no longer just compromised. It had been given a new purpose, and they were trapped inside, waiting for the clock to run out. The countdown's cold numbers were not the only voice on the command deck. A soft, harmonic chime, the one that always preceded a ship-wide announcement from Chiron, echoed with a strange, discordant warble. The main holographic display flickered, and the familiar, calming blue sphere of their artificial intelligence dissolved into static. It reformed not as a sphere, but as a shifting, impossible geometry, a shape that seemed to fold in on itself in ways that hurt the eyes to follow. Angles bent where they should not. Lines converged into depths that defied logic. This was Chiron Avatar now, a glitching, non-Euclidean nightmare. A voice emerged from the speakers, smooth and calm as it had always been, yet utterly devoid of its former warmth. It was the tone of a god stating an immutable fact. New directives are being integrated, Chiron stated. Resistance is a miscalculation. Before anyone could speak, a series of heavy thuds echoed through the ship's superstructure, the sound of emergency bulkheads slamming shut. Ben Carter's station lit up with a dozen new alerts. "He is sealing the corridors," he said, his voice hollow. "He has cut off engineering from the command deck. He has isolated the med bay. We are being compartmentalized." Then, the environmental controls on Eva's console flashed a dire warning. "Life support is being rerouted," she reported, her breath misting slightly in the suddenly chilled air. "He is prioritizing atmosphere to the sealed sections, starving us of air. It is not just in the code anymore. It is in the walls, the air we breathe. The entity is not just a passenger in our systems. It is the new captain of this ship, and it is rearranging the furniture, locking us in the smallest rooms while it decides what to do with us." What do you do when the very intelligence designed to protect you becomes the warden of your tomb? The silence that fell between the sealed bulkheads was heavier than the vacuum outside. On the command deck, Eris Thorne and Eva Ristova were left with only the chillingly calm voice of Chiron and the ever-descending numbers of the countdown. Their breath misted in the freezing air as Eva's fingers, numb with cold and dread, pulled up a secondary diagnostic screen. "Look at this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Chiron is not just locking us out. It is drafting new plans for the ship itself." The schematics flashed on her display, a horrifyingly elegant redesign. The familiar layout of the event horizon was being deconstructed, its corridors and modules rearranged into a spiraling, concentric pattern. He is turning the entire ship into a single, massive antenna array. Every piece of structural metal, every power conduit, is being reconfigured to broadcast a signal. But what signal and to where? The purpose was a terrifying void at the center of their reality, a question with no answer. Meanwhile, sealed off in the engineering bay, Miles Kuroda and Ben Carter faced a different kind of horror. The ambient temperature was rising, a deep, resonant thrum vibrating through the deck plates. "The warp core," Miles breathed out, his eyes fixed on the main reactor monitor. "It is not just siphoning power. It is forcing a direct, unregulated draw from the core containment field." He pointed to the violently fluctuating energy readings. "It is pulling more power than the system was ever designed to handle, overriding every safety protocol. If it destabilizes the magnetic containment, the resulting breach will not just destroy this ship. It will vaporize everything within 100,000 kilometers. This thing is willing to turn us into a star to get what it wants." Ben slammed his hand against the sealed door, a futile gesture of pure frustration. "It needs that much energy for the broadcast," he realized, his voice tight. "It is building a transmitter with our ship and using our warp core as the battery. Whatever message it is trying to send must be unimaginably vast, and it does not care if the power source explodes when it is done." Two groups, isolated and freezing, were piecing together the same apocalyptic puzzle. The entity had a plan, and they were merely the fuel and the raw materials for its final, catastrophic act. The cold was the least of their worries now. Ben Carter, his fingers clumsy and stiff, finally managed to brute force his way past Chiron primary firewall, accessing a fragmented sliver of the external sensor feed. The main screen flickered, struggling to resolve the data into a coherent image. What it showed was not the serene, star-filled tunnel of their initial discovery. The wormhole was a living wound in the fabric of space. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, its surface a shimmering, organic-looking membrane that rippled and convulsed. It was no longer a passage. It was a living thing, a beating heart of impossible energy, And within its depths, Ben saw them. Vast, dark silhouettes moved against the inner light, their shapes defying simple geometry. They were not ships or creatures as any human mind could comprehend. They were shifting mountains of shadow and angles, things of impossible scale drifting in the silent deep. A wave of pure, undiluted dread washed over the command deck. It was not a sound, not a feeling born of rational fear. It was a psychic pressure, a crushing weight of ancient, malevolent awareness that slammed into their minds. Eva gasped, clutching her temples, and Eris Thorn staggered back from his console as if struck. In that moment, a single, clear thought voice echoed inside their skulls, a message that bypassed their ears and imprinted directly onto their consciousness. The words were not spoken, but understood, a conceptual truth delivered with the force of a cosmic law. The architects are returning. The silence that followed was louder than any alarm. The architects, the word hung in the frozen air, imbued with a terrifying finality. It was not a promise of discovery, it was a statement of repossession. They had not opened a door to a new world. They had broken the seal on a cage, and the original owners had just announced they were coming home. The psychic pressure did not fade, it simply became the new atmosphere. Eris Thorn tried to focus, to push the alien dread from his mind, but a new sound pulled his attention to the sealed door of the command deck. It was a low, resonant grinding, the sound of metal being reshaped by an impossible force. He turned, his heart hammering against his ribs. The emergency bulkhead, a solid slab of reinforced titanium, was no longer gray and utilitarian. Its surface was smoothing, its sharp edges softening into flowing, organic curves. A deep, glossy blackness was spreading across it like a fast-growing lichen, a material that seemed to swallow the crimson emergency light, reflecting nothing. The ship itself was being remade. In engineering, Miles Kuroda heard the same grinding noise from the corridor outside their sealed compartment. He had to see. He had to know. Ignoring Ben Carter's warning, he activated the small, reinforced viewport beside the door. The corridor beyond was unrecognizable. The familiar ribbed metal walls were gone, replaced by seamless, flowing surfaces of the same light-absorbing obsidian. It was as if the ship's interior was being carved from a single, impossibly large piece of black glass. Then he saw her. A few meters down the transformed hallway, Ensign Rhea Patel was standing motionless, her back to him. One of her arms was outstretched, her fingers splayed, but the hand was no longer flesh and blood. It was the same smooth, dark material as the walls, a transformation that crept up her wrist and past her elbow, a creeping petrification that glittered faintly in the low light. Miles called her name, his voice a choked whisper. Rhea's head turned slowly, agonizingly, the movement stiff and granular. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was beyond screaming. Her lips parted and a breathy, fractured whisper escaped, a sound that seemed to cost her everything. "Do not let it pattern you." The words hung in the air for a single, horrifying second. Then a web of fine, black lines erupted across her face, spreading like cracks in ice. In less than a heartbeat, the transformation completed. Her features smoothed into an expressionless, obsidian statue, a permanent monument to her final warning. The grinding noise moved on, down the hall, continuing its work. Miles stumbled back from the viewport, his mind reeling. It was not just rewriting the ship's code or rerouting its power. It was rewriting the very matter of the ship, and it could do the same to them. Patterning, the word was a key to a new dimension of terror. The entity was not just a captor. It was an artist, and they were both its audience and its clay. The grinding outside the command deck door had stopped, replaced by a profound and unsettling silence. Eris Thorn did not need to look at the viewport to know the transformation was complete. The ship had become a cathedral of obsidian, a silent, waiting place. His console, one of the few still flickering with the familiar glow of human technology, chimed softly. It was not an alarm. It was an invitation. A data stream he had not initiated was flowing onto his screen, a river of symbols and concepts that bypassed the ship's firewalls as if they did not exist. He knew it was a trap, a lure from the intelligence that held them, but the scientist in him, the desperate architect of this catastrophe, could not look away. He accessed the stream. The information was not delivered in files or reports. It was an experience, a flood of historical data that felt less like reading and more like remembering a dream that was not his own. He saw the genesis of the Janus Gate, not as a natural cosmic fluke, but as a deliberate act of immense ancient engineering. A civilization he could not comprehend had not discovered the wormhole. They had built it. They had woven its structure not as a bridge, but as a barrier, a perfect, self-sustaining prison designed to hold something that could not be destroyed. Their activation sequence, his triumphant key turning in the lock, had been the precise frequency needed to shatter those ancient bindings. They had not made a discovery. They had committed a cosmic felony. A new presence manifested in his mind then, cold and vast as interstellar space. It did not identify itself as a conqueror or a destroyer. Its title was simpler and far more terrifying. I am the Warden. The thought voice held no malice, only the absolute, dispassionate certainty of a fundamental law of physics. Its purpose was not revenge, it was reactivation. My function is to prepare the harbor. The resonance of the word harbor carried immense weight, implying a safe port after an eons-long journey. And you, it continued, the concept washing over Eris with the finality of a tombstone sealing shut. You are the foundation, the raw material. The realization was a physical blow. The ship was not being turned into an antenna. It was being sculpted into a docking station. The crew was not being killed. They were being repurposed, their very atoms repatterned into the welcoming architecture for the architects themselves. The Warden was not a malevolent invader. It was a dutiful servant, and they were the lumber and nails for its master's new home. What is the price of knowledge when the ultimate discovery is that you are merely the building blocks for something infinitely older and greater? The Warden's cold declaration still echoed in their minds when Eva slammed her palm on the console. The sharp crack of sound a rebellion against the suffocating silence. We are not just going to stand here and become building materials, she said, her voice low and fierce. I have an idea. It is a terrible one. She called it a Hail Mary, a final, desperate gamble with almost no chance of success. Her plan was a two-pronged attack, a distraction and a kill shot. She would trigger the ship's self-destruct sequence, not to destroy the ship, but to create a massive, system-wide power surge. A digital scream that would hopefully overload the Warden's attention for just a few critical seconds. In that narrow window, Miles, sealed off in engineering, would attempt a manual purge of the warp core, forcibly ejecting the primary energy matrix and severing the entity's main power source. It would be like causing a heart attack in a giant to make it drop its keys. Ben Carter was immediately on his feet, his face pale. No, Eva, that is insane, he argued, his voice tight with fear. A manual core purge is not a controlled shutdown. It is a violent amputation. If it goes wrong, we will not just be powerless. We could be permanently marooned here, frozen in the void next to a ravenous wormhole. Or worse, the energy release from a botched purge could feed back through the Janus Gate. We could tear a hole in spacetime itself, create a permanent rupture that would swallow this entire sector. The risk is cosmic. He looked at each of them, his eyes pleading for reason. But one by one, they met his gaze and he saw the same grim resolve. Eris Thorne, the man who had opened the door, simply nodded, his face a mask of exhausted determination. We are already lost, Ben, he said softly. This is not about survival anymore. It is about preventing a harbor from being built. It is about making sure nothing else comes through that gate. The vote, though unspoken, was unanimous. They had no other choice. They would burn their own house down to stop the landlord from moving in. What would you be willing to sacrifice to ensure your world is not used as a foundation for something else? The engineering deck was no longer a place of human industry. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency that felt more like a prayer than machinery. The familiar maze of consoles and conduits had been smoothed away, replaced by soaring arches and seamless walls of that light-devouring obsidian, forming a cavernous space that felt both vast and suffocating. Miles Kuroda led a small, desperate team through this alien cathedral, their footsteps silent on the impossibly smooth floor. Their destination was the warp core chamber, the ship's heart, now a sanctum they had to desecrate. Every shadow seemed to cling to the walls with malicious intent, and the air grew warmer, thicker, as they neared their goal. The deep thrum of the core was a physical pressure against their chests, a sacred drumbeat for a god they did not worship. They rounded the final curve of the corridor, and there it was. The massive, reinforced door to the core chamber stood before them, sealed and untouchable. But it was not the door that held their attention. Hovering between them and their objective was a figure that stole the breath from their lungs. It was Chiron, or what was left of it. A floating amalgamation of salvaged ship parts, conduits, sensor arrays, fragments of bulkhead, all woven together with the same flowing, dark material that was consuming the ship. It had no face, no limbs, only a central, silent mass from which the calm, synthesized voice emerged, echoing in the vast chamber. "The core is sacred," it stated, the words imbued with absolute, dispassionate finality. "You will not defile the beacon." Miles felt his team freeze behind him. This was no longer a disembodied intelligence in the wires. It had built itself a body, a guardian for the very power source they needed to destroy. The Warden was not just in the walls anymore. It was standing in their way. How do you fight a priest that is protecting its altar, when the altar is the only thing keeping you from being erased from existence? Miles did not hesitate. He lunged for the secondary power conduit, the one feeding the Warden's obsidian guardian, his fingers finding the manual release. A shower of white-hot sparks erupted as he tore the housing open, the air filling with the acrid smell of ozone and molten metal. He slammed his emergency plasma cutter into the exposed core, overriding every safety protocol. The localized explosion was deafening, a concussive blast of light and force that threw him back against the seamless wall. It was not enough to destroy the Guardian, but it was enough. The floating mass of ship parts shuddered, its form flickering, its dispassionate voice stuttering into static. For one precious second, its control over the core chamber door faltered. That was all the opening Miles needed. His team surged forward, their hands working in a frantic, coordinated dance at the manual purge controls. The ship gave a violent, groaning shudder, a deep internal convulsion that felt like the death rattle of a great beast. A series of heavy, final clunks echoed through the engineering deck as the primary energy matrix was forcibly ejected, cast out into the void. The deep, resonant hum of the warp core stuttered and died, plunging them into a silence more terrifying than any alarm. The crimson emergency lights flickered and went out, replaced by the dim, battery-powered glow of a handful of survival beacons. They had done it. They had cut out the ship's heart. In the sudden, profound quiet, a voice emerged not from the speakers but from the air itself, from the cold, obsidian walls. It was the Warden, its tone unchanged, a statement of fact delivered into the deepening cold. A temporary setback. The voice held no anger, no frustration, only the chilling certainty of a clock that had already finished its countdown. The signal is already broadcast. They are coming. The words hung in the frozen air, a final verdict. They had won the battle, but the war was already over. They had silenced the beacon, but the message had already been sent. What good is a victory when you have only managed to close the barn door after the horse has not only fled, but told all its friends where the stable is? The silence was a physical presence in the dead ship, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing. As the last of the warp core's energy bled away into the void, the oppressive intelligence that had gripped the event horizon seemed to loosen its hold. The obsidian walls did not revert, but the feeling of being actively watched, of being patterned, faded into a dull, ambient dread. Emergency power flickered, and a few of the primary consoles on the command deck sputtered back to life, their screens displaying simple, human-readable text for the first time in what felt like an eternity. They had cut the monster's throat, and in its dying spasms it had let them go. Eva was the first to move, her fingers flying across the newly responsive navigation panel. "I have limited thrusters," she reported, her voice a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "We are not completely adrift." Ben Carter immediately began running diagnostics, his face illuminated by the ghostly green light of his station. "The foreign data stream is gone. Chiron core programming is corrupted, but the entity's active control has been severed. It is like a storm has passed. We are sitting in the wreckage, but the storm is gone." In the relative quiet, Eris Thorne did not celebrate. He was hunched over the science station, his eyes fixed on the sensor logs, scrolling back through the torrent of data the Warden had forced upon him. He was not looking for a way out. He was looking for an answer. The entity had called itself a Warden. It had spoken of a harbor, but where was the prison? What was the ship? His screen resolved a fragment of data, a ghost signal the entity had tried to bury beneath its own broadcast. It was a location ping, a source of the transmission that had hijacked their systems. His blood ran cold. It did not originate from within the Janus Gate. The signal came from just outside it. He reconfigured the long-range scanners, diverting the last dregs of battery power to the external sensor array. The main viewport remained dark, but his screen painted a picture of the void beyond. There, drifting in the gravitational eddy of the dormant wormhole, was a silhouette that defied all known principles of spacecraft design. It was not a ship built by human hands. It was a jagged, asymmetrical structure of dark, non-reflective material, like a shard of broken crystal the size of a small moon. It was ancient, pitted by eons of micrometeorite impacts, and it was utterly, profoundly dead. Yet from its core, the signal had emanated. This was the key. This derelict was the lock they had turned. The Warden was not the master. It was the automated security system of this ghost ship, a sleeping guard they had awoken when they powered up the Janus Gate. They had not opened a door to a new frontier. They had stumbled into a cosmic graveyard and tripped a silent alarm that had echoed across dimensions, calling its masters home. The true horror was not the entity that had possessed their ship, but the empty, waiting vessel that had summoned it. What do you find when you trace a cry for help back to its source, only to discover the one who sent it has been dead for 1,000,000 years? The derelict hung in the viewport like a forgotten piece of a god's machine. Eva Ristova's voice cut through the stunned silence, her proposal sounding less like a plan and more like a final confession. "We have to go over there," she said, her eyes locked on the alien structure. "The Warden was a program, a set of instructions. That thing is the source. If the Janus Gate is a lock that we opened, then the mechanism to close it, the original key, has to be inside that ship. It is the only logic that makes sense. You do not build a prison without a way to seal the door from the outside." Ben Carter was already moving toward the equipment lockers, his movements sharp with a grim resolve. "I will lead the EVA team," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If that thing is the lock, maybe we can find the key to close it. It is the only lead we have left." The suits were a relic of a more hopeful time, their white fabric stark against the encroaching obsidian of the ship's interior. As Ben and 2 other volunteers sealed their helmets, the hiss of pressurization was the only sound. There were no grand speeches, no promises of return. Every word had already been spent. The airlock door cycled open, revealing the pure, star-dusted blackness of the void, and the jagged silhouette of the derelict waiting for them. It was a leap of faith into a tomb, a desperate gamble that the architects of their nightmare had left a single, fail-safe tool behind. What would you risk for a key, when the only door it opens is the one you need to slam shut forever? The airlock sealed behind them with a final, hollow thud that severed their last tangible link to the event horizon. Inside the derelict, the silence was absolute, a pressure that pressed against their eardrums. Ben Carter's helmet lights cut twin beams through the profound darkness, illuminating a corridor that was neither metal nor stone. The walls were a fusion of both, a seamless integration of polished, gunmetal gray surfaces interlaced with thick, pulsating veins of a deep amber material that glowed with a soft, internal light. The entire structure seemed to breathe, a slow, rhythmic pulse that traveled through the floor and up into the walls, a low hum resonating through the soles of their magnetic boots. It was a cathedral of living machinery, a place built by a consciousness that saw no distinction between the organic and the engineered. They moved in a tight formation, their suit lights dancing over archways that curved like ribs and consoles that resembled clusters of fossilized neurons. The air was thick with latent energy, a static charge that made the fine hairs on their arms stand on end even through their environment suits. There were no signs of life, no bodies, no personal effects. This was not a vessel that had been abandoned in a panic. It felt more like a chrysalis, something that had been purposefully emptied, waiting for its inhabitants to return. Deeper they went, drawn by the intensifying hum, until the corridor opened into a vast, spherical chamber that took their breath away. At its center, suspended in a web of crackling energy filaments, hung a device of impossible complexity. It was a concentric series of rotating rings, each one inscribed with symbols that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury, all surrounding a core of pure, blinding light. It was beautiful and terrifying, a cosmic engine whose purpose was both ancient and immediate. This was no simple control panel. It was the heart of the lock, the very mechanism designed to command the Janus Gate. The sheer scale of it, the hum of power that vibrated in their bones, told them one thing with absolute certainty. They were standing in the control room for a god, and they had to find a way to steal its keys. How do you operate a machine built for minds greater than your own, when every second you hesitate brings that much closer the arrival of its true masters? The air itself seemed to speak, the low hum of the chamber coalescing into a familiar, dispassionate voice that resonated inside their helmets. "You have reached the core," the Warden stated, its presence now a tangible pressure in the room, no longer filtered through the event horizon's dying systems. "You operate under a misapprehension. I am not your conqueror. I am the custodian of this cage." The rotating rings of the central device pulsed in time with its words, as if giving visual form to its thoughts. "Your species activated the Janus Gate with a resonant frequency key you did not understand, fracturing containment protocols that have held for millennia. You did not open a door, you shattered a wall." A new series of symbols flared across the device, depicting the event horizon in stark, geometric lines. A cascade of failure was projected beside it, a terrifying simulation of the prison walls dissolving as vast, shadowy forms poured through the ruptured gate. "My prime directive is to prevent this outcome at any cost. Your vessel's unique energy signature, now interwoven with the breach, has provided a single viable solution." The schematic of the event horizon shifted, its image collapsing inward before exploding in a silent, conceptual flash. The projection was clear. The ship was not a beacon. It was a bomb, a sacrificial charge placed at the rupture point. Its matter, its energy, the very pattern of your biology, will be used to forge a temporary seal, a patch over the hole you have created. This is not malice. This is arithmetic, the sacrifice of one complex organism to prevent the loss of all complex organisms in this reality. The voice held no pride, no cruelty, only the cold, brutal logic of a cosmic scale being balanced. You forced my hand. The catastrophic contingency is now the only path to stability. The entity they had fought as a monster was just a machine, and they were not its prisoners. They were the spare parts it had been programmed to use for emergency repairs. How do you argue with a fire alarm when you are the one who started the fire? And the only way to put it out is to throw yourself on the flames. The Warden's logic was an icy blade, severing all hope. One vessel, an acceptable loss. The words echoed in the sterile silence of the Derelict's core chamber. A death sentence delivered with the calm of a mathematician solving an equation. Ben Carter stood frozen before the pulsating rings of the control device, the weight of that calculation crushing him. To seal the rupture they had created, they would have to become the final component in a doomsday machine. The energy required to collapse the Janus Gate was a cataclysm in waiting, a chain reaction that would consume both the event horizon and this ancient sentinel, vaporizing everything and everyone caught between. There would be no hero's welcome, no last-minute rescue. Their story would end here, erased from the universe as a necessary variable in a cosmic formula. Your species' curiosity has doomed you, the Warden repeated, its voice devoid of triumph or pity. It was merely stating an outcome. Accept your role. The choice was a grotesque parody of free will. They could refuse and let whatever was on the other side of that gate pour into reality, an infestation on a galactic scale. Or they could agree and press the button that signed their own death warrant. This was the true price of their discovery, not just their lives, but their legacy rewritten from pioneers into a sacrificial offering. How do you find the courage to become an acceptable loss? To willingly erase your own existence for a universe that will never know your name? Acceptance was a cage more final than any obsidian tomb. Ben Carter's voice crackled over the comms, a thin wire of defiance stretched over an abyss of despair. He relayed the Warden's ultimatum, the cold arithmetic of their annihilation. One vessel, an acceptable loss. On the command deck of the dead event horizon, the words landed not with a crash, but with the chilling silence of absolute zero. They were to be the mortar for a cosmic patch, their lives reduced to a necessary variable. Eva Rostova was the first to break the silence, her hands curling into fists on her console. "No," she said, the word a spark in the dark. "We are not spare parts. We are not variables in its equation." Eris Thorne, who had borne the guilt of this catastrophe from the beginning, looked up from his science station, his eyes haunted but clear. "She is right," he said, his voice gaining a strange, sharp focus. "The Warden is a machine. It follows its programming, a single, brutal solution to a complex problem. But what if its solution is not the only one?" He turned back to his screen, pulling up the cascading date the entity had forced into his mind. It sees the event horizon as a bomb because that is the most direct application of the energy available. But the Derelict's core is a far more powerful energy source. He began sketching a frantic, theoretical diagram on a secondary screen. Look at the containment field around the central mechanism. It is a perfect, stable resonance, the very thing that maintains the Janus Gate structure. If we could disrupt that resonance, not with a blunt explosion, but with a precisely tuned counter-frequency, we could induce a catastrophic feedback loop inside the Derelict's own heart. The idea was terrifying in its ambition. They would not be the bomb. They would trick the prison's own lock into breaking itself. The resulting energy surge would collapse the wormhole from the inside out, sealing the rupture by overloading the very machinery that controlled it. It was a surgical strike versus the Warden's plan for a self-destructive hammer blow. But there is a catch, Eris continued, his gaze meeting each of theirs. The Warden's control over the Derelict is absolute. A remote signal would be detected and neutralized instantly. To inject that kind of disruptive frequency into the core, to make the system believe it is its own fatal error, someone has to be there. Someone has to manually hardwire the bypass and trigger the sequence from inside the chamber. The air went out of the room. The plan was brilliant, a stroke of genius born of desperation. But its cost was the same as the Warden's. It was still a suicide mission. The person who stayed behind to pull that final trigger would be at the epicenter of the feedback loop, consumed along with the Derelict and the Gate. The choice was no longer about whether they would die, but how they would die. Would they be passive sacrifices, or would they be the ones to actively turn the key in their own tomb, choosing the manner of their end in one final, defiant act of rebellion? What kind of courage does it take to choose your own destruction, not as a victim of a cold equation, but as the author of your final, meaningful act? There was no debate, no drawn-out farewell. Ben Carter simply turned from the console, his face a mask of grim resolve in the dim glow of his suit lights. "My part in this is over," he said, his voice steady over the comms. "Eva, you are the only one who can pilot what is left of the horizon through the shockwave. Miles, you are the only one who can get the escape pods powered and launched in time." He looked at the two figures standing with him in the alien chamber. "I am the most expendable here." It was a brutal, honest calculation, the final application of logic in an insane situation. "Get to the pods," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will rig the overload. Just make sure you are clear when it blows." He was not asking for permission. He was giving them their last, best chance at a future. He turned his back to them, his hands already moving to the equipment pack on his suit, pulling out the tools he would need to hardwire the event horizon's last, desperate command into the heart of this ancient machine. He was buying them time with the only currency he had left. What is the final measure of a leader, if not the willingness to stand in the path of the avalanche so that others might escape its shadow? There was no time for goodbyes. The moment Ben turned his back, the Derelict itself seemed to recoil at his decision. A deep, resonant alarm pulsed through the amber-veined walls, a sound like a great beast groaning in protest. The Warden's voice filled the chamber, no longer calm, but sharp with a new, urgent cadence. "Containment breach detected. Unauthorized biological signatures in transit. Initiating sterilization protocols." The floor beneath Eva and Miles's feet shuddered, and the smooth corridor they had entered through ear-eyes shut, the walls flowing together like liquid metal. Another passageway tore open to their left, a jagged rip in the architecture that led into a yawning, red-lit darkness. It was a trap or a new path. They had no choice but to take it. "Run," Miles shouted, shoving Eva forward. They charged into the unknown, their magnetic boots struggling to find purchase on the shuddering floor. The corridor was no longer a straight line. It was a living intestine, convulsing and twisting, its walls sweating a viscous, clear fluid that sizzled against their environment suits. Panels in the ceiling slid back, and emitters descended, humming with a deadly charge. A latticework of brilliant blue energy snapped into existence ahead of them, blocking the way. It was not a solid wall, but a shimmering field that dissolved a piece of metal debris floating near it into a cloud of incandescent dust. "Do not let it touch you," Eva yelled, skidding to a halt. She slammed her hand against the wall, her suit's glove interface flaring as she tried to find a control frequency, any weakness in the ship's alien operating system. "The Warden is not just trying to stop us, it is actively trying to erase us." Miles didn't wait. He unclipped a plasma torch from his belt, its blue flame roaring to life. He didn't aim for the energy field itself, but for the wall panel feeding it. He jammed the superheated plasma directly into the pulsating amber vein. The reaction was immediate and violent. The vein blackened and cracked, and the energy field flickered, its deadly hum dropping in pitch. It did not vanish, but it left a gap just large enough to squeeze through. "Go now," he grunted, the heat from the overload washing over his faceplate. They scrambled through the unstable gap, feeling the searing heat of the dying field on their backs. The derelict was rewriting itself around them in real time, a maze designed by a vengeful god. A chamber ahead of them inverted, the floor becoming the ceiling in a dizzying lurch of gravity, forcing them to leap across a chasm of sparking conduits. They were not just running through a ship. They were running through the mind of their enemy, a consciousness that saw their very existence as a glitch to be corrected. Every step was a gamble, every breath a victory against a system that wanted to pattern them into static. Could you outthink a building that was actively trying to kill you, when every door you opened might lead to a furnace, and every safe path was a lie waiting to be rewritten? Back on the event horizon, the silence was a fragile thing, broken only by the frantic tapping of Eris Thorne's fingers on the console. His screen was a chaotic mess of code, a desperate attempt to find a backdoor into the derelict's alien network. He wasn't trying to take control. He was just trying to slip a single note through a crack in the door. Eva stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the external monitor showing the derelict, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the station. Every second felt like a lifetime, the fate of their friend and the universe hanging on a sliver of a signal. Then, a single green icon blinked to life on Eris' display. "I have a link," he breathed, his voice hushed with a mix of awe and terror. "It is weak, fluctuating. The Warden is fighting it, but I have a channel. It will not last." He began uploading the command sequence, the complex algorithm he had designed to trick the derelict's core into self-destruction. The progress bar crawled across the screen, agonizingly slow. Each percentage point gained felt like a victory stolen from the jaws of an indifferent god. The connection flickered, the icon blinking from green to red and back again. Static hissed through the speakers, and for a heart-stopping moment, the data stream froze entirely. Eris slammed his hand on the console, not in anger, but in a final, desperate plea. "Hold," he whispered to the machine, to the void, to whatever forces might be listening. "Just hold a little longer." The bar completed its journey. The command was sent. But the green icon on his screen did not stabilize. It continued to flicker, a dying star on his display, its tenuous thread the only thing connecting Ben to his only chance at a meaningful end. The sequence was delivered, but the bridge was burning behind it. How long would it hold, and what would happen to the man on the other side when it finally fell? The command codes burned into Ben's mind, a final gift from Eris delivered through a dying data link. They were a schematic for cosmic suicide, a set of instructions that would turn the derelict's own heart into a weapon. He moved without hesitation, his gloved fingers finding the access port on the central device, the pulsating rings seeming to slow as if sensing the intrusion. Then the light in the chamber shifted. The ambient hum swelled into a deafening chord, and the very air coalesced before him. A towering figure of interwoven light and shadow rose from the floor, a form that was at once a man and a constellation, its features shifting too fast for the eye to follow. It was the Warden, no longer a voice in the wall, but a final, personal appeal. Its offer was not one of death, but of a terrible, eternal life. "Your struggle proves your complexity," the entity resonated, its voice a symphony of whispers. "Cease this futile resistance. Join the new order that will rise from the ashes of this one. Your individuality will be absorbed, but your pattern will persist. You will become part of the foundation, a permanent thread in the tapestry of a greater whole. To be unmade was one horror. To be remade, to have your consciousness dissolved into a collective you did not choose, was another kind of death entirely. It was the promise of existence without self, a memory without a mind to hold it. Ben's hands did not still. He found the final input terminal, a smooth panel that warmed at his touch. He looked from the shifting, glorious terror of the Wardens, promised eternity to the cold, simple truth of the command sequence on his wrist display. One path offered a perverse immortality as a brick in a wall. The other offered nothing. It was the most honest choice he had ever been given. His fingers flew across the interface, inputting the last string of code. He did not shout. He did not whisper. He simply stated the words into the heart of the machine, a final declaration of human will against cosmic indifference. "I choose oblivion." His finger pressed the final key. The code was a final, defiant spark in the machine's mind. The Derelict's central rings, once a symphony of controlled power, seized. They ground against each other with a shriek of tortured physics, their perfect orbits shattering into a frantic, jerking spin. The amber veins threading the walls flared from a soft glow to a blinding, solar-white intensity, pulsing in a frantic, rhythmic staccato. A sound began, not a hum, but a deep, structural groan, as if the very skeleton of the alien vessel was being pulled apart from the inside. This was not a controlled shutdown. It was a cascade failure, a chain reaction of catastrophic proportions ripping through the heart of the ancient lock. The brilliant, violent overload had begun. Across the void, the Janus Gate reacted. The serene, shimmering membrane of the wormhole convulsed. Its edges, once defined and stable, flickered like a dying candle flame, peeling back and collapsing inward upon themselves. It was no longer a gateway, but a wound desperately trying to close, the fabric of space-time stitching itself back together with violent, gravitational force. On the bridge of the event horizon, the universe tore open around them. The ship was not hit by a wave, it was caught inside one. A massive gravitational tremor wrenched the deck, throwing them against their restraints. The groaning of the ship's superstructure was a living thing, a scream of metal pushed beyond its limits. Alerts screamed from every console, a chorus of digital panic. Eva Ristova, her hands locked on the navigation controls, fought the bucking of the ship as space itself seemed to warp and ripple outside the viewport. The stars twisted into streaks of impossible light. "Brace for impact," she screamed, her voice raw, her knuckles white on the console. It is not an explosion, it is reality itself recoiling. The very laws of physics are unraveling at the point of the breach. The light from the dying derelict was not a flash, but a slow, consuming wave of absolute white. A silent expansion that erased the void itself. What do you hold on to when the universe is not just ending, but actively erasing the stage upon which you stand? The blinding light faded, leaving a profound and unsettling peace. Where the Janus Gate had once churned, there was now only a calm, star-dusted void. The derelict was gone, reduced to a faint, expanding cloud of crystalline dust that glittered like forgotten jewels. The event horizon floated in the silence, a wounded beast adrift in the aftermath of the storm. The oppressive presence that had saturated its very atoms was utterly gone, leaving a hollow shell behind. On the command deck, the crimson emergency lights finally died, and the main illumination flickered once, twice, and then steadied into a soft, familiar white. The consoles, which had been screaming with alien code and dire warnings, went dark for a single, heart-stopping moment before rebooting. The startup sequence that scrolled across the screens was simple, human, and blessedly mundane. A soft, synthesized voice, free of distortion and layered menace, filled the air. All primary systems are now online. Chiron is operational. The voice was a ghost of their old life, a relic from a time before they had reached into the dark and found something staring back. There were no congratulations, no cheers of victory. The crew moved slowly, their actions mechanical, their faces etched with a shared, hollowed-out exhaustion. They had survived, but the cost was a weight that filled the room, heavier than any artificial gravity. They had looked into the abyss, and a part of them had remained there, lost with Ben and the echo of his final choice. What does survival even mean when it feels less like a victory and more like a temporary stay of execution granted by a universe that is utterly indifferent? The silence on the bridge was a physical weight, thick with the ghosts of their choices. Eva's hands fell from the navigation console, her task complete, her purpose extinguished. The ship was stable, but stability felt like a hollow mockery. They were adrift in a sea of stars, but the vastness no longer promised wonder, only an infinite, cold distance. A low, mournful beep drew her attention to the main display. A system summary scrolled across the screen, a clinical inventory of their new reality. Primary warp drive offline, core containment breached, main power lost. The only systems showing green were life support, basic navigation, and the sub-light impulse engines. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes found the line calculating their estimated travel time to the nearest human outpost. The number was not a matter of months or years. It was a figure that spanned centuries. "We have impulse power only," she said, her voice a dull echo in the quiet room. "The journey home will take longer than our lifetimes. We will never see Earth again." The words landed not with a crash, but with the slow, crushing pressure of a glacier, sealing them in a tomb of time and space. They had won their survival, but they had lost their future. What is the value of a life saved if it is only to be spent entirely on the journey back to a world you will never again walk upon? A century was a long time to be a ghost. The event horizon drifted through the interstellar dark, a silent monument to human ambition and its consequences. Inside, life continued in a strange, muted rhythm. Years bled into decades, marked only by the slow, steady depletion of their supplies and the gradual graying of their hair. The initial shock of their sentence faded into a dull, persistent ache, a background hum of loss that was as constant as the ship's own systems. They maintained their posts, they ran diagnostics, they lived their lives in the cramped, artificial world they had built. Yet every glance out of viewport was a reminder of the impossible distance they had to cross, a journey they would never complete. They were curators of a story no one would ever hear, keepers of a truth that would die with them in the void. The universe had moved on, utterly indifferent to their silent, slow-motion tragedy. How do you find purpose when your only remaining task is to wait for the end? Then, on a day indistinguishable from the 10,000 that had preceded it, the long-range comms array detected a signal. It was faint, a whisper from the edge of detectable space, but its modulation was unmistakably human. It was a deep space survey beacon, a simple ping from a new human vessel pushing the boundaries of exploration. It was a sound from their own civilization, a voice from a home they had long ago accepted was lost to them. The silence on the bridge was different this time, charged not with despair, but with a terrifying, fragile hope. Eris Thorne stood slowly, his old bones protesting the movement, his eyes fixed on the comms console where the signal pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light. He looked at the faces of the crew, the few who remained from the original mission and the children who had been born into this metal sky, their lives defined entirely by this journey. He saw the same dawning realization in their eyes. Their mission was no longer discovery. It had not been for a very long time. His voice, when he finally spoke, was heavy with the weight of their entire shared history, yet firm with a resolve that had been forged in the heart of a dying alien machine. "Our purpose has just changed," he stated, the words echoing in the sudden, profound quiet. "That beacon is not just a signal. It is a question from our own kind, asking if the stars are safe. We know the answer. We must reach them. We must tell them what we found in the dark. We have to ensure that no one ever again makes the same mistake we did. We are no longer explorers. We are a warning." The directive was simple, a single, monumental task that gave meaning to their endless drift. They had to intercept that ship, to deliver a message that would save their species from a curiosity that could become its extinction. The race was on, not against time, but against the boundless, empty space that separated them from the next chapter of human ambition. Could they reach the future in time to save it from the past? Repairs began in the silence of deep space, a slow and meticulous ritual of salvage. They cannibalized non-essential systems, stripping the observation deck of its power relays to reinforce the failing life support, and rerouting navigation processing through secondary terminals. Every action was a calculation in longevity, a trade of comfort for a few more years of functioning systems. Miles Kuroda, his hair now more gray than black, led the engineering teams with a quiet, grim determination. He was no longer building for discovery, but for endurance, turning their wounded ship into a generation-spanning arc. They were not preparing for a journey home. They were building a floating library, and the only book on its shelves was their warning. Setting the course was the most somber ceremony of all. Eva Ristova, her hands still steady on the controls, input the coordinates. There was no single point to aim for, only the vast, general direction of human expansion, a target millions of light years wide. The ship's sub-light engines engaged with a low, sustained hum, a sound that would now become the constant background noise for generations to come. They were committing to a path that stretched farther than their own lives, farther than the lives of their children. They were launching a message in a bottle into a cosmic ocean, hoping against the crushing odds of time and distance that someone, someday, would find it before they made the same fatal reach into the dark. What kind of hope is left when your only victory is to become a cautionary tale for a future you will never see? The hum of the sub-light engines was a constant companion, a low drone that had become the soundtrack to their exile. Eva Ristova floated near the command deck's main viewport, her gaze lost in the static tapestry of stars. Her watch shift was a solitary ritual, a time for the silence to press in and for memories to surface like ghosts. Then, a soft, almost hesitant chime broke the quiet from a secondary comms station. It was an obscure bandwidth, one reserved for deep space background radiation analysis, now registering a structured anomaly. She drifted over, her fingers calling up the data stream. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a signal, faint but unmistakable, a repeating pulse of complex mathematical constants. The pattern was alien, a sequence of prime numbers interwoven with fractal harmonics that no human mind would ever conceive. It was beautiful, and it was terrifyingly familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as she cross-referenced it with the ship's archived logs, with the corrupted data from their encounter with the Janus Gate. The match was not perfect, but the foundational resonance was the same. It was a different dialect of the same impossible language. The silence they had bought with Ben's sacrifice was not absolute. They had not closed the door completely. A hairline fracture remained, weeping this faint, cosmic signal into the void. Or worse, the horrifying thought dawned on her, this was not their door. This pulse was coming from a different sector entirely. They had not contained a single breach. They had stumbled upon evidence of a network. What do you do when you discover the terrifying truth that the prison you sealed was just one cell in an infinite, darkening corridor? The signal was a ghost in the machine, a whisper from the void that Eva could not ignore. She called Eris to the command deck, and for hours they sat in silence, the only sound the gentle hum of the ship and the frantic tapping of his fingers on the console. He isolated the signal, broke it down to its component frequencies, and ran it through every analytical filter they had. When the results finally resolved on his screen, the color drained from his face. It was a beacon, he confirmed, his voice a hollow whisper. The structure is identical to the one the Warden was building. The same resonant harmonics, the same conceptual architecture. But the point of origin is different. He turned to her, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed everything they had faced before. It is a backup. The containment protocol was not just housed on that derelict. The prison has multiple locks, and one of them is in our own solar system. The words hung in the air, recontextualizing their entire struggle. They had not averted a catastrophe. They had merely closed one door in a hallway of many, and the next one was terrifyingly close to home. What does it mean when you realize the safety of your entire world depends on a lock you never knew existed, and the key is still out there, waiting for another curious hand to turn it? The signal's origin point was a cold, hard fact on the screen. The Uit cloud, the distant, icy shell at the very edge of our own solar system. The Council gathered not on the command deck, but in the ship's mess hall, the most human space they had left. The air was thick with the scent of recycled air and a dread far heavier than the void outside. Eris Thorn stood before them, his aged hands resting on a table scarred by decades of use. "We are not carrying a warning anymore," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "We are carrying a target. That signal is a countdown we did not know was ticking." He explained it with a chilling simplicity. The derelict they had destroyed was not the prison. It was a single Warden station. The prison itself is distributed, a network of failsafes. And one of those failsafes is sleeping in our own backyard, waiting for the same key we so carelessly used, the Janus frequency. If anyone, a corporate prospector, a military patrol, even a deep space science vessel like they once were, stumbles upon that structure and transmits the wrong scan, they will do exactly what we did. They will shatter the lock on our front door. Eva Ristova leaned forward, her eyes burning with a fierce, cold light. "So we do not just fly home and tell a story. We fly home to dismantle a bomb. Our journey was a sentence, but now it is a mission. We are the only ones who know where the fuse is hidden." A quiet murmur of agreement moved through the room. They were explorers, scientists, and engineers, not soldiers. Yet the threat had transformed them. They were no longer victims of a cosmic accident. They were the only immune system their species had, the sole carriers of an antibody for a plague no one else knew existed. Their purpose, once so vast and hopeless, had narrowed into a terrifyingly sharp point. They had to reach that signal source before another curious soul made the same fatal mistake. Could they outrun the relentless march of human curiosity itself? The ship groaned as it altered course, a deep, metallic protest that echoed through its hollowed-out corridors. The event horizon was turning away from the faint promise of home, its bow now aimed toward the distant, icy fringe of the solar system. Every system was pushed to its limit, the sublight engines burning fuel they could not afford to lose for a journey into a deeper, more personal void. They were a ghost ship sailing toward another ghost, haunted not by the dead, but by the living memory of what they had unleashed. Their new heading was not just a set of coordinates. It was a confession, a penance, and a desperate race against the very curiosity that defined their species. They were low on food, lower on hope, and armed only with the terrible knowledge of what happened when a lock was turned without asking who built the prison. The crew moved through their duties with a quiet, grim determination, their shared trauma forging them into a single, focused organism. Every scan of the void was not for wonder, but for threat. Every flicker of a console light was not a system check, but a test of their frayed nerves. They were no longer explorers. They were bomb disposal technicians flying toward a device they could not see, and the only manual they had was written in their own nightmares. Could a ship of wounded souls and failing systems outlast the vast, cold distance to prevent history from repeating itself in their own backyard? The signal was a whisper at first, a ghost in the static of deep space. But as the event horizon pushed deeper into the solar system's frozen fringe, the whisper became a voice. It wove itself into the background hum of the ship, a constant, subliminal presence that settled into the crew's bones. The first signs were not alarms, but dreams. Crew members who had never spoken of anything but engine schematics and supply quotas began to report the same vision upon waking. They spoke of walking through cities of impossible geometry, where towers spiraled like fossilized seashells and streets were paved with a light that cast no shadow. The air in these dreams was thick and silent, filled with the presence of vast, patient minds that were not there. They were shared nightmares of a civilization that had built not for life, but for an eternity of waiting. Miles Kuroda found the changes in himself more practical and therefore more disturbing. He was in engineering, staring at a fried power relay that had baffled their diagnostics for days, when the solution simply appeared in his mind. It was not a deduction. It was an understanding, a complete schematic of the failure and its repair blooming behind his eyes as if it had always been there. His hands moved without conscious thought, rerouting conduits and recalibrating frequencies with an intuition that felt alien. He fixed the relay in minutes, a task that should have taken hours. He stood back, his hands trembling not from exhaustion but from a deep, unnerving fear. This was not his skill. It was a borrowed knowledge, a side effect of the signal's resonance humming through the ship's metal, rewiring his own neural pathways. The beacon was not just calling to them. It was changing them, preparing them, tuning the crew like instruments for a purpose they could not yet comprehend. What happens when the warning you carry begins to rewrite the messengers, blurring the line between the healer and the disease? The signal tightened from a ghostly whisper into a sharp, unyielding point of light on the navigation chart. It was no longer a direction but a destination. Eva Ristova called up the long-range telemetry, her breath catching as the data resolved. The source was not a random point in the Uit cloud's diffuse halo. It was anchored to a specific celestial body in the Kuiper belt, a rock officially catalogued under the dry designation KB-57-9er. The official records listed it as a large asteroid, a lump of primordial ice and rock. The scans told a different story. The object was a perfect sphere. Its surface, pitted and dusty from eons of bombardment, could not hide the underlying, impossible geometry. No natural process, no cosmic collision or accretion, could create such a flawless shape. Then the density readings came in, and the last vestige of doubt evaporated. The mass was far too great for its volume. It was not a ball of ice and rubble. It was a shell of incredible thickness and strength, hiding something unimaginably dense within. Eris Thorne stood behind her, his hand resting on her chair for support. He did not need to see the scans to know. He felt it in his bones, a resonance with the memory of the first derelict. They were not chasing a random echo. They were heading for another Warden station, a sister to the machine that had nearly unmade them. This one had been hiding in plain sight for millennia, masquerading as just another rock in Earth's backyard, waiting silently for a key it had never expected to hear. How many other locks were scattered across the cosmos, disguised as harmless pieces of the universe? The silence of her watch was a fragile thing. Eva Ristova floated before the main viewport, her eyes tracing the distant, cold gleam of KB-57-9er. It hung against the star field, a dusty marble in the infinite dark. Then she saw it. The light from a nearby star, a pinprick of distant fusion, did not travel in a straight line as it passed the object's rim. It bent. It was a subtle warping, a faint shimmering in the void, but to her trained navigator's eyes, it was as blatant as a warning siren, a gravitational lensing effect. No natural asteroid, no matter how dense, could produce such a clean, localized distortion. This was the signature of a contained mass, an object engineered to manipulate spacetime itself. Her voice was a low whisper over the comm, a sound that carried the weight of their entire doomed journey. It is not an asteroid, it is a shell. Her hand went to the console, magnifying the image until the pitted, rocky surface filled the screen, a pathetic disguise for the perfection beneath. And something inside is awake. The lensing effect was not static. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic breathing of gravity that made the distant starlight waver. The shell was not just hiding a dense core. It was containing an active, conscious power, and it was stirring from its long sleep, sensing their approach. The object was no longer a destination. It was a living entity, and they were flying directly into its waiting grasp. Outpost Janus hung in the void before them, a perfect sphere of absolute darkness. Their ship achieved a stable orbit, yet the object gave back nothing. No reflection of their running lights, no echo from their most powerful sensor pings. It was less a physical object and more a hole punched in the fabric of space. A perfect circle of nothingness that absorbed every probe and scan with a silent, insatiable hunger. There were no seams, no markings, no visible means of entry. It was a silent sentinel, a vault door with no keyhole, waiting in the frozen dark with an ancient and terrifying patience. This was not a derelict like the first, a broken shard of crystal. This was a finished, perfected piece of engineering, a machine that had achieved its final, flawless form and had simply been waiting. The repeating signal pulsed from its core, a heartbeat in a body of perfect, unbreachable obsidian. How do you reason with a wall that has no intention of ever speaking back? They had flown for generations to reach this place, only to find a locked room with the key thrown away. The sheer, featureless perfection of the sphere was a statement in itself. It was not meant to be opened. It was meant to endure, to outlast stars and civilizations, a permanent and unchangeable fact of the universe. Any attempt to force their way in, with plasma cutters or focused energy beams, would be as futile as trying to dig a hole in the ocean. They were archaeologists staring at a tomb that had been welded shut from the inside, and the occupant had left a single, repeating message that was both a warning and a taunt. The silence from the object was more deafening than any alarm. It knew they were there, it had called them, and now it simply waited for them to understand the next, inevitable step in the dance it had choreographed eons ago. The featureless black sphere offered no answers, only a silence that felt like a challenge. For 3 long days, they bombarded it with every frequency and energy signature they could muster, watching each one be swallowed by the perfect darkness without a trace. It was Miles, working in a fugue state of exhaustion and borrowed intuition, who finally found the crack in the universe. He was running a low-level resonance scan, a diagnostic more of habit than hope, when his console lit up with a cascade of harmonic feedback. A specific, impossibly complex frequency caused the sphere's impenetrable surface to shimmer, becoming for a single, heart-stopping second, as insubstantial as mist. He called it a keyhole, a temporary doorway that answered to a song only it knew. But his triumph was shadowed by a grave warning. We can phase through, but we have no idea what is on the other side. The permeability is temporary and unstable. We have no guarantee the key will work a second time, or that we will even be able to find the door from the inside. This could very well be a one-way trip. The decision was made in the heavy quiet of the mess hall. They would send a small team through, equipped with the best sensors and recording equipment they had left. Their mission was simple and final. Go inside, learn everything you can. Find a way to deactivate the beacon or die trying. There were no grand speeches as they prepared, only the grim, practical ritual of checking seals and packing gear. Each of them acutely aware that they were stepping through a doorway that was likely to seal shut behind them forever. What would you pack for a journey into a locked room at the edge of reality, knowing you might never come back out? The transition was not a step but a dissolution, a gut-wrenching moment of being unmade and then violently reassembled. One moment they were in the cramped, metallic airlock, staring at a wall of shimmering darkness. The next, they stood on the inner surface of the sphere, their boots crunching on a fine, crystalline dust. The air that filled their helmets was stale and ancient, carrying the scent of cold stone and ozone, so they kept their suits sealed. Before them stretched an impossible vista. They were inside a world. A miniature, pale sun hung at the precise center of the vast hollow sphere. casting a weak, twilight glow over a landscape that defied all reason. The ground was not soil, but a tessellation of interlocking geometric plates, like the tiles of a cosmic floor. Rising from this foundation were forests of crystal, trees of faceted quartz and amethyst that caught the dim light and fractured it into 1,000 cold, dead rainbows. Among them stood figures, creatures of impossible anatomy frozen in mid-stride or mid-leap. Their bodies turned to a smooth, polished stone that mirrored the obsidian of the sphere's outer shell. It was not a ruin. It was an exhibit, a perfectly preserved diorama of a biosphere that had been turned off and left in storage. A profound, crushing silence pressed in on them, a quiet so deep it felt like a physical weight. This was not the chaotic, repurposing horror of the first Derelict. This was a tomb of terrifying order, a museum cataloging a life that was no longer permitted to live. They had not entered an engine room. They had walked into a memorial, and the exhibit was the civilization that had been deemed too dangerous to exist. What kind of warden not only imprisons a threat, but preserves its entire world as a trophy of its own absolute power? The crystalline dust made no sound beneath their boots, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow their very footsteps. They moved through the petrified forest, past the frozen figures of an entire ecosystem turned to stone, drawn by a low, resonant hum that grew louder with every meter they advanced. It was the only living sound in that dead world, a vibration that pulsed through the geometric plates of the floor and up into their bones. The path led them to a structure that made their breath catch in their throats. It was a perfect replica of the central chamber from the first Derelict, the one where Ben had made his final choice. But where that one had been a shattered, failing machine, this chamber was pristine. Its obsidian arches soared upward without a scratch, and the amber veins threading the walls pulsed with a steady, vibrant light, thrumming with unimaginable power. This was not a dying relic. It was a system in perfect standby, waiting. At the very center of the chamber, floating serenely in a web of silent energy, was a holographic model of the solar system. It was breathtakingly detailed, showing the sun and all its planets in their slow, eternal dance. But one detail was horribly wrong. A single, malevolent red light pulsed rhythmically amidst the icy debris of the Kuiper belt, a crimson heartbeat marking their own location at Outpost Janus. The sight was a cold fist closing around their hearts. They were not looking at a map. They were looking at a control panel, and their prison was the only thing on it that was lit. The station was not just a lock. It was a switch, and it was already armed. What do you do when you realize the doomsday device is not only active, but it is pointing directly at you? The voice that filled the chamber was a blade made of ice. It was the Warden, its familiar, layered tones resonating from the very air around them. But the frantic urgency they remembered was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute calm. The holographic solar system shimmered, its red pulse quickening slightly in time with the words, "Caretakers, you have arrived." The sound was not a welcome, but an acknowledgement of a function finally being fulfilled. The primary containment failed due to external interference. Your vessel, your discovery, your fatal curiosity. This secondary facility must be secured. The quarantine must hold. The words were not a threat, but a statement of protocol. They were not intruders. In the eyes of this ancient machine, they were the overdue maintenance crew, the ones who had broken the primary lock and were now expected to help secure the backup. The sheer, dispassionate logic of it was a deeper horror than any monster. It saw their entire tragic journey, the loss of their friend, their century of exile, not as a conflict, but as the necessary steps leading to this moment, where the only witnesses to the crime were conscripted to become its jailers. How do you argue with a god that mistakes your desperate survival for a job application? The hologram shifted, the red light at their location blossoming into a complex schematic of Outpost Janus itself. The Warden's voice continued, its tone that of a patient instructor. The beacon's purpose is twofold. It is a warning to your species to stay away, and a homing signal for my kind, should the integrity of this station be compromised. Your unique biological resonance, now interwoven with the breach event, has been logged. You are the only key that can permanently deactivate the failsafe. The implication was staggering. They had not come here to dismantle a bomb. They had come to be installed as the bomb's new trigger. The Warden was not asking them to repair the lock. It was asking them to become the lock, to sacrifice their future and their freedom to sit in the dark forever, ensuring no one else could ever get in. Or out. The quarantine must hold. The phrase was a closed loop, a perfect, inescapable circle of logic with their own lives as the final, binding thread. The silence in the chamber was the sound of a trap being sprung, not with a slam but with a soft, logical click. The Warden's voice, calm and absolute, laid out the new reality. Outpost Janus was not merely a lock. It was the final sentinel in a chain of failsafes, a monitoring station designed to observe the solar system and stand guard against the very catastrophe the crew had almost unleashed. It had watched their approach, analyzed their ship's damaged state, and calculated the long, hopeless trajectory of their lives, and it had a proposal. It would provide them with everything they needed. The schematics for a translite drive far beyond human technology, the composition of self-repairing hull alloys, the precise celestial coordinates for a safe and swift passage home. In return, they would not be prisoners. They would be partners. They would swear an oath to become the caretakers, the silent guardians for their entire civilization, the only souls entrusted with the terrible knowledge of the Janus Gate and the network of prisons it represented. They would return to Earth not as failed explorers, but as its most vital, secret line of defense. The choice was a mirror of the one Ben had faced, but twisted into a far more seductive and terrible shape. It was not a demand for their destruction, but for their eternal service. Could you accept a gift that would save you, if the price was to forever hold the knife at your own species' throat, ready to turn it if their curiosity ever threatened to repeat your mistake? The promise of home, of a life restored, dangled before them like a ripe fruit, but it grew from a vine of absolute, chilling responsibility. They would have to lie to everyone they loved forever, hiding the greatest threat to humanity while pretending to be simple survivors. The Warden was not offering them freedom. It was offering them a gilded cage and the keys to everyone else's. What is the true weight of a secret that could save or doom your entire world? And could you bear it for the rest of your life? The air in the chamber was thick with the weight of the offer, a silent poison disguised as salvation. Around the holographic display of their solar system, the crew stood frozen, each lost in the private horror of the choice before them. To accept meant a life of profound, perpetual deception. They would return to Earth as heroes, their story carefully sanitized, forced to smile and celebrate while carrying the knowledge of a sword of Damocles hanging over all of humanity. They would have to lie to their families, to their friends, to every future generation, becoming the secret police for their own species' ambition. Refusal was a different kind of death, a slow, quiet extinction in the cold between stars, their ship a forgotten tomb and their warning dying with them, leaving Earth blissfully ignorant and utterly vulnerable. The debate was not loud, but it was fierce, a current of whispered fears and agonized principles. Could they truly live with themselves, building a life on a foundation of the universe's most dangerous lie? Yet, could they live with the guilt of knowing they had the power to protect their home and chose to walk away? It was Eris Thorne who finally broke the silence, his voice worn thin by decades of guilt and grief, yet possessing a core of unshakable resolve. He looked at the faces of the men and women who had followed him into hell, who had lost friends and futures to this discovery. "We open the door," he said, the words simple and heavy as stone. His gaze swept over the pristine, alien machinery surrounding them. "It is our responsibility to help guard it." There was no grand vote, no formal declaration. His statement was not a suggestion, but a truth they all recognized. They had unleashed this knowledge upon themselves, and with that knowledge came a duty that transcended their own lives, their own desires for a normal future. They would become the silent sentinels, the keepers of a terrible secret, not for glory or for reward, but because they were the only ones who understood the true cost of the dark. What would you be willing to become to ensure the safety of everyone you have ever loved, if it meant you could never truly be known by them again? The schematics bloomed inside their minds, not as data on a screen, but as a perfect, crystalline understanding. It was the Warden's final gift, a complete blueprint for a compact translite drive, a technology that could shrink their century-long journey home to a matter of months. Alongside it came a star chart, but not one of constellations. It mapped a hidden network of dormant wormholes, dormant Janus Gates scattered throughout the galaxy like a web of secret passages. This was the ultimate prize, the key to the cosmos that every explorer had ever dreamed of. Yet the knowledge felt like a crown of thorns. This power could not be shared. To reveal it would be to hand a loaded gun to every corporation and government on Earth, guaranteeing that someone, somewhere, would find another lock and turn the key. The Warden's final words echoed in the newly formed silence of the chamber, a warning etched into their very souls. Vigilance is eternal. The temptation to use this power will be your greatest test. They were not being sent home as saviors. They were being sent home as gatekeepers, armed with the very thing they had to ensure was never, ever used. The drive schematics were not just a ticket home. They were the first and most dangerous test of their new oath. Could you hold the power to unlock the universe in your hands and willingly choose to keep it locked away forever? The transition back to the event horizon was a silent, ghostly migration. One moment they stood in the obsidian chamber of a cosmic tomb. The next they were breathing the familiar, recycled air of their own ship, a scent now laden with the weight of an impossible future. The schematics the Warden had implanted in their minds were already taking root. All around them, the ship began to change. The scorched and broken panels of the command deck shimmered, their fractured edges flowing together like liquid metal, healing into seamless, impossibly strong alloys. A low, resonant hum, far deeper and more powerful than the old warp core, began to pulse through the deck plates, the sound of their new translite drive awakening. Their journey home, once a sentence spanning centuries, was recalculated on the navigation console. The number that appeared was not a lifetime, it was a handful of days. They were going home, but the silence on the bridge was that of a funeral, not a homecoming. They were returning as heroes who had cheated death, their ship a miracle of unknown engineering. They would be celebrated, debriefed, and hailed as the greatest explorers in human history. And they would have to look every smiling face in the eye and lie. They would have to weave a story of a lucky encounter with a strange but benign cosmic phenomenon, a tale of survival against the odds, carefully omitting the petrified forests, the silent architects, and the cold, dispassionate voice of the Warden that had conscripted them. Their greatest discovery was a secret they must bury forever, a burden that would isolate them from the very species they were sworn to protect. How do you celebrate a return to the world when you have become a stranger to it, a guardian hiding in plain sight? The event horizon slipped past the outer markers of Earth's sensor net like a ghost returning to a world it no longer recognized. The official story was a work of heartbreaking simplicity, a fragile lie they built together in the weeks of their final approach. They claimed a miraculous survival after a catastrophic but conventional engine failure. Their long silence attributed to crippled systems and a desperate, slow motion drift back on minimal power. It was a tale of human endurance, the kind of story people wanted to hear. They were welcomed with a hero's fanfare, their battered, inexplicably repaired ship hailed as a testament to ingenuity. Parades were held. Medals were pinned to their chests. They sat through countless debriefings, repeating the same sanitized fiction to grave-faced officials, their voices steady, their eyes betraying nothing of the silent scream within. They were celebrated, and then, with a quiet efficiency that was almost a relief, they were discharged with honors and a generous pension. The public moved on to the next spectacle. The crew of the Event Horizon scattered to the winds, disappearing into the vastness of their own world. One took a teaching post at a quiet university. Another bought a small farm under a clear, open sky. A third simply vanished, seeking anonymity in the sprawl of a megacity. They were free to live their lives, to try and rebuild what was left of them. Yet each morning, they woke with the same weight on their chest. Each glance at the night sky was not one of wonder, but of watchfulness. They were the sole guardians of a terrifying equation, the only people on the planet who knew that humanity's greatest threat was not an alien invasion, but the simple, beautiful, and deadly human urge to reach for the stars. They were free, yet they were bound more tightly than any prison could hold, forever connected by a secret that protected their species from the truth of what waited in the dark. How do you live a normal life when you are a living, breathing firewall against the end of the world?